What's up, folks? This is Dan from Discern. And before I get started, a couple quick things. One, I gotta warn you, this is a long review. I get that. I like this band a lot. I got a lot to say, and I'm quite a chatty Cathy. Second, my neighbors have been doing fireworks, so if you hear some booms and such, that's what it is. All right, these are my thoughts on the new album from King's Kaleidoscope, Beyond Control. King's Kaleidoscope is a massive pop and alternative band from Seattle, Washington. I think there's like 10 members in this group, which is like 3 times the amount of most normal pop or rock groups. With their eclectic group of instruments, including your rock band basics like bass, drums, electric guitars, keyboards. They also have cello, violin, saxophone, trumpet, trombone, and flute. These guys and gals have a one-of-a-kind sound with flavors from alternative rock, math rock, electropop, DJ and hip-hop beats, funk, jazz. A succinct way, if there is one, to describe them would be orchestral indie pop. The lead singer, songwriter, and only full-time member of the band, Chad Gardner, has said before that his background as a DJ and a producer influences the way he creates music even now, which is clear when you see his masterful ability to compose and arrange complex structures of melodies and rhythms. But unlike a producer who samples from far and wide, to compile a vast array of sounds and textures, King's Kaleidoscope provides much of that array up front, organically, in the studio, just by the sheer amount of instrumentation they bring to the table. This band originated in 2010 at the now extinct Mars Hill Church. In the days when it was growing and gaining a large following under Mark Driscoll, King's Kaleidoscope was just one of a handful of bands that all fell under the banner of Mars Hill music. Citizens and Saints, led by Zach Bolin, The Modern Post, led by Dustin Kensrue, the Sing Team, Ghost Ship. King's Kaleidoscope started as a worship band, a very unique sounding and refreshing one, but still a worship band, congregationally leading the church at Mars Hill. And in that role, they released 3 EPs over 3 years. Then they left Mars Hill in 2013, joined up with Bad Christian, who was starting to flex their muscles as more of a label, and released their 4th EP, Live in Color. Then in 2014, with Bad Christian and Tooth and Nail, they finally released their debut full-length album, Becoming Who We Are, which was really the first step in King's Kaleidoscope truly becoming who they are and developing a sound separate from Sunday morning worship, but still drenched in Christian truth and gospel realities. I talked about that album in a review years ago. I will post a link to it in the description. That album was sort of half in, half out, where you could really feel the transition between where they came from, these arrangements of old hymns and classics, to where they were going, which is more personal songs from Chad, where he was basically forced to test his lyrical chops. And since then, they've released 2 more EPs, which were just live versions of previously released tracks, good nonetheless. But now, we finally have some brand new music from King's Kaleidoscope with their 2nd full-length album, Beyond Control. This album really does feel like the logical next step for this band, a band which has really become, and these are Chad's own words, Chad and Friends. He really is the only full-time musician in the group. He recorded this album, the whole thing, in his basement, and he really is the driving force behind the arrangements and obviously the lyrics. These are his songs, but fleshed out through most of the same musicians who have been playing with him since this all began. On a musical level, there's a lot more funk, jazz, R&B, and soul influences on this record. It's definitely a shift from the indie pop jam band flavor they've always had. The upbeat songs on this album definitely have just a more funky and soulful vibe than on previous records. There's also some great individual sounds and tones used on this album, very unique and memorable. We got, the electric guitar that sounds sort of like Godzilla on Enchanted, the deep bellowing piano sound on most of it, the unison bass and vocals at the end of In This Ocean Part 1, or the weary falling of Chad's vocals on the first half of A Prayer. These little moments and features on the tracks have always been a part of King's Kaleidoscope's sound, and I'm glad that they are still here on this record too. And speaking of features that, carry on from their previous albums, I love the interludes on this album. Just like their previous full-length record, King's Kaleidoscope uses those interludes so masterfully to maintain a smoothness to the varying energy levels and dynamics of the different tracks. The interludes carry you from one place to another gently and gracefully rather than having these sharp jumps and dips in the dynamics from track to track. And the interlude Friendship on this one is so cool. The most lighthearted track on the album. If you're a fan of King's Kaleidoscope, if you feel pretty tied to their music, there's no way you can listen to this track and not be grinning from ear to ear. It's basically Chad and Blake, I believe, both just noodling on their respective instruments. Chad is vocally humming and crooning. Blake is on the trombone, and the backbone of this track is held down by a steady drum groove and piano holding down that rhythm section. They sort of lay the groundwork and let these two guys just have fun with it, alternating back and forth, often trying to mimic each other's melodies. And the vocals are seated mostly in the right ear and the trombone in the left. And these guys are taking this less seriously than anything else on the album. There's chatting back and forth. There's laughing, a reference to Soulja Boy, blaring obnoxious noise into the trombone. And it culminates in both of them coming together in a unified melody to fade it out. And that song obviously must have been a blast to toy with and record, and that totally translates in the finished product. It's a blast to listen to. Musically, another thing this album does really well, which is unsurprising for King's Kaleidoscope at this point, is the layering and the massive amount of simultaneous tracks that they manage to balance and keep from conflicting with one another. I mean, how can they pull off such a complex web of activity and mold it into such a singular, balanced sound? It's a tremendous accomplishment. It's a sound that makes returning to this album an utter joy because you'll hear something new, something slightly buried or partially obscured that you never noticed before. These are tracks that can handle some serious mining and some serious digging into trying to see what you can hear next. And as I mentioned before, that this album has a lot more funk, jazz, R&B sounds and grooves than previous releases. Sort of in line with that, I noticed that the vibe of this record is much less spazzy and frenetic, especially from the drums. The whole band, I think, is just tighter and more unified. It's not that they dumbed the music down or anything, simplified it in terms of complexity. They just dole out that complexity in smaller doses and just more strategically. It's apparent that the big, all-out, blazing moments were meant to be reined in on this album. And the vibe and groove from these songs is still bold as ever. It's just more in the pocket, more close to the chest, rather than exploding in every direction, from track to track. And you see this especially from their most active songs, which would be like Enchanted or In This Ocean Part 1. In fact, realizing that those two songs are the most chaotic they get, save for the very powerful and dramatic ending to A Prayer. Having those songs really as your most active is a pretty definitive statement, I think, that this album is more tame than the last few. There is no Defender or Felix Culpa on this record. And I think that's actually a sign of maturity for this group because they managed to deliver the same level of quality and excellence in this album. It doesn't feel lacking, doesn't feel underwhelming, but they pulled the reins back a little bit. And on a lyrical side of things, as the group transitions to more of a Chad focus rather than a congregational church focus, the lyrics have obviously become less worship or congregationally styled. And on this record, they push that even further. There are no hymns, no covers on this album. It's all originals from Chad, who actually had help from Zach Boland from Citizens and Saints, helped with some of the lyrics. The stories and feelings he's describing in these songs are singularly personal to him, but they can be broadly interpreted and connected to by many people listening. I mean, the feelings he writes about in these songs are human feelings. They're common to the human experience, and I think especially to the Christian experience. But Chad, has such worshipful, Christ exalting moments and thoughts in his personal experience that you end up sharing in that through these tracks and feeling a very strong, powerful sense of worship and praise. If you follow his train of thought through these songs, if you bear his emotions along with him, you will undoubtedly find yourself probably in tears of thankfulness, in awe of God's grace. So overall, this is a further departure from the structure and lyrical styles of music they were making when they first began at Mars Hill. But the heart of these songs, the heart of Chad, the songwriter and lyricist, is still beating strongly in praise to Christ. It's just in a more personal, open, and exposed way. Now, the lyrical theme of this album, as the name indicates, Beyond Control, carries, I think, through this whole thing from beginning to end. You have references to living beyond control, using even that specific phrase in the first full track, Enchanted, the following track, Most of It, and also in This Ocean Part 1. And the whole album really is a journey within that theme. The pacing and the natural progression of this whole album really paints the picture of that transformation, finally living beyond control. So, I mean, from beginning to end, it takes you there, but it doesn't leave you with, a perfect, euphoric, heavenly, everything's all right type of scene. It ends you with Trackless C, which is a hope-filled send-off into the unknown. It's a bold step out into the trackless sea, a place where no one has gone before. But it's bold because, as the song says, all my life is life with thee. The promises of God and the love of Christ that he has experienced is what gives him hope. It's what informs his thinking. It's his reality as he sings. It's more than just an enchanted fairy tale story. It's real. And while I'm on the topic of lyrics, I have to talk about the explicit track, because as to be expected, it's become a pretty big talking point in the wake of this album's release. If you weren't aware, Chad drops the F-bomb twice in the song A Prayer. And it's sort of a big deal. It's also sort of not a big deal. This is a complex, not black and white, not definitely sinful or definitely not sinful, not definitely wise or definitely not wise. It's not that type of situation. Let's just look at some points, I guess, and help us think through this. First, why? Well, I'll let Chad speak for himself on that one. I've linked to a couple interviews down in the description, a written one from spirityouallmusic.com, and a video from Bad Christian that was on Facebook, in a summary of what he has to say, basically. He wrote this because it's actually how he felt. He felt a fear that was so intense that he described it as effing violent. And I don't doubt his sincerity. In fact, I confess that I've thought and said things very similar in prayer-like contexts when I'm alone. The weight of sin, the burden that your own conscience can have on you, or in Chad's specific case, severe anxiety that he's suffered from his whole life. I understand the humanity in what he said, so let's keep that in mind. I don't think this was a flippant use of explicit language. It wasn't a shock jock type of thing. And if you think it was, well, I guess you don't believe what Chad's saying in those interviews, and that's up to you. Second point, was it necessary? We know why he did it, in a sense. Was it necessary, though? I'm pretty divided on this one, because I'll explain why, I guess. On one hand, I think it was unnecessary. It's a descriptive word, and a word that only distracted me from the moment rather than emphasizing it. There are so many other words he could have used, right? And if we start thinking, yeah, but the F word, shows he really means it, then I think we kind of have a problem with ourselves as listeners when we can really only be moved by explicit language. How little grasp of the vast breadth of the English language do we understand if we can only use explicit language to prove a point? There are other visceral words that I would argue are equally biting and harsh, but not explicit, that he could have used. He could have used his vocal performance to bring weight and punch to that line, emphasizing that fear, which I think he did actually pretty well anyway. What I'm trying to say is, I don't think he had only one option, the nuclear option. You gotta drop the bomb. But as I thought about this earlier this week, my brain sort of countered that argument and said, if the F word is just one of many options he could have used, why didn't all the other honest and real and spilling my heart moments on the other songs hit me in the same way? I mean, just 2 songs before A Prayer, we have the track Sabotage/Home, which has lines like this in it. I pour myself out for myself. What a selfish fool. I'm so defeated and uninspired. I'm beginning to have my doubts. What do I believe in? He's in a pretty dark, honest, human place, isn't he? But really, do you feel, the weight and the burden and the tenacity of those dark thoughts? Or did you feel that, finally, when he said his fear is effing violent? I mean, I'll admit I didn't feel it until the song A Prayer. There is a level of abrasion and discomfort that the F word translates that the other lyrics didn't. And I think that's meaningful. That's powerful. And that track, as a whole, beyond that phrase, was definitely the most emotionally powerful and most brightly Christ-exalting on the whole album. I mean, I was crying when that song transitions from a dark and lonely feel to Christ basically bursting on the scene, reminding you of his everlasting love, his purchase of you on the cross. I mean, that is a powerfully dynamic song. So last point to make, I guess, is that King's Kaleidoscope also released a clean version of this album, where the explicit lyric in this song is replaced with the word vicious. It's got some alliteration there, basically. The fear is vicious, violent. Definitely still a good lyric, I think. I'm a firm believer that this was a very wise decision to release a clean version, because I was thinking, what about people who don't feel comfortable having the song on in the stereo or in the car in front of their kids? I mean, the F word is extremely audible and prominent in one particular moment in that song. It's not hard to miss. So for those whose consciences are offended or they're distracted by it, there's an alternative, For those who aren't bothered by it but are actually encouraged, there's the original. I think releasing 2 versions was the best way where he can speak his mind but also care enough about the wide variety and backgrounds of believers that would be listening, to provide them with an alternative. To keep their consciences from being defiled, to love them in that way. I mean, similar to Paul's attitude in Romans 14. And if you're curious, the vinyl is the explicit version, the CD is the clean version, and digitally you can get both. Also, both versions are on Spotify. So, which should you buy? Which should you listen to? I say go where the Spirit leads, listen to your God-given conscience, and make the decision that will lead to God's greater glory. If you listen to this song and the F word becomes a distraction rather than an emphasis, you should probably choose the clean version. You're meant to think about more than just those words. That's not the focus of this song. But if that word actually brings encouragement to you in this song, it emboldens the message Chad is delivering, it actually causes you to see Christ all the more glorious in the second half of the track, choose the explicit version. It's not black or white. It's a complex decision. I get that, but it is something I think you should think about. Now, this video has already gone quite long, so let me angle this to a rational conclusion. Most of the songs on this album are longings for this transformation, this to live beyond control. They're yearnings to change, to spiritually grow. And they lay out the situation, what our current state of existence is, pains, stresses, difficulties, death. And they answer those situations, though, with the realities and promises of the gospel. Christ will make all things new one day. God is faithful despite your sinfulness. There is hope in every situation because Christ has purchased us with his blood. We're God's adopted children. And the album as a whole sort of mirrors those two situations as well. Some songs lean heavier toward that negative side, such as Sabotage/Home and Gone. And some lean heavier toward that positive side, like Lost or Trackless Sea. And as you progress through the album, you feel those highs and lows, these moments of peace and euphoria, and you also feel those moments of distress and anguish. And I think that's the reason why this album is resonating with so many people. It mirrors the heart and the life of a Christian better than anything I've heard all year. A Christian, is a sinner who has been saved by grace. Christians are keenly aware of their failures, their rebellious nature, their sin. It can be overwhelming and burdensome. But Christians trust in Christ, who has forgiven all our sin, past, present, and future. He took our burden and nailed it to the cross. Some albums I've listened to, have nailed that heart of weariness and sorrow and burden, but they miss the joy of experiencing grace. That's the end goal of the gospel, to get you there. God's glory and your good. That's the end goal. And some albums are overflowing with bliss and gladness, but they miss the dark corners of our lives, the areas that we all try to ignore. But those are the corners that God knows better than you. He sees our wicked hearts, and he still loves us enough that he bore our punishment on the cross. Romans 5:8, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And this album, I think, is just so richly honest in both those directions. The lyrics, the arrangements, the performances, it all reflects both those feelings and the conflict that Christians often feel internally. And it does it so well. Like many others, after listening, I was thinking, yes, that's exactly how I feel. He did it. He put my thoughts and feelings to music. And going front to back, the numerous times I've listened to this album already, I can't help but tear up at times still. It's very impactful. It totally resonates with me. This is probably my favorite album I've heard all year, and I've heard quite a lot of albums. So thank you for watching this very long album review. If you're still watching, you're the best of the best. You are more than a fan, you're a friend. Aww. No, but seriously, thank you. If you enjoyed this video and haven't yet subscribed to the channel, I encourage you to please do so. Remember, new album reviews, just like this one, usually a little shorter, release every Friday, and new track reviews release every Wednesday. If you have a question or a comment about this album or not about this album, let me know. You can comment below this video. You can tweet at me at discernreviews, or you can send me an email, discernreviews@gmail.com. Did you listen to this album from King's Kaleidoscope? What are your thoughts? Did you love it like me? Did you hate it? Somewhere in between? I hope to hear from some of you. Anyway, hope this helps. See ya.